2012 seems like such a long time ago, doesn't it? It's been nearly 10 years since the release of Dishonored. Trust me, I checked, and 10 years should be enough to change anybody, myself included. In 2012, I was a 14-year-old kid worried about girls and grades, and gaming to me at this point was much more a matter of functionary satisfaction than critically thinking about any merits of a game's artistic expression. Personally, I grew up in a fighting game household with the likes of Street Fighter Alpha, Turbo, Virtua Fighter, and SNK scattered across the floor of our small military housing, so things like quarter circle punch and back quarter circle kick were the functions that I cared about in my video games. Functions that were designed to elicit a response from the player upon completion were the things that mattered to me. Truthfully, it took until haphazardly discovering Dishonored in a return bin at my local GameStop did I begin to look at the medium as something beyond just a tool to complete functions with, and something that I could stop, listen, observe, and hopefully begin to understand. Often on this platform, I'll listen to creators weave nostalgic tales about games that helped create the foundations in which Dishonored's story and gameplay were modeled upon. Thief, System Shock 2, Deus Ex, all together seem to form a holy trinity of gaming reverenced by those who had the privilege to experience those titles on PC in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And for those guys and gals, good for you. But for many younger gaming fans like myself, games of this design were few and far between in the late 2000s and early 2012s. This is not to say they didn't exist. Titles such as Bioshock and Dead Space demonstrate a want and a need for a deeper artistic understanding of video games as a medium, despite feeling suffocated by an ocean of gritty, tough military shooters that dominated the console gaming space at that time. And therein, I think, lies my problem in the generational divide I often feel from these creators and these titles. I am a human being who was born on the cusp of the new century and steeped in the popular post 9/11 American culture. The context of cultural fears and paranoia have not disappeared since 9/11, but rather been recontextualized. Rather than enemies and divisions coming from within our borders, our enemies in the 2000s were much, much easier to understand and blame. They were another, a different, an outsider that represented a threat to our particular way of life. Whether they were brown-skinned terrorists or gray, scaly humanoid aliens from the planet Zanzibar, the purpose was always really the same. And I guess in that respect, I am incredibly guilty, as I can now see how the culture around me shaped my understanding and appreciation for the art I consumed. I had no Thief, no Deus Ex, or System Shock to build an appreciation upon, and games that came out in reverence to their design philosophy were often just that to me. Games to complete, enemies to slash, stab, club, consequences and themes to be damned. Now, I'm not going to sit here and argue that Dishonored is a pillar of gaming history, but I will say that it is one of the first games that I felt a personal attachment to mechanically, but most importantly from a story and thematic standpoint. And I think understanding why certain things make us feel a certain way is an important way for us to understand ourselves as well. Dishonored begins, and you, the player, are Corvo Attano, royal protector of the Empress Jessamine of the Empire of the Isles. The Empire of the Isles is an archipelago consisting of 4 islands. The far northern island of Tivia, renowned for its harsh winter and wines. The island of Morley, a fiercely independent people famous for their love of the arts. Serkonos, a southern jewel of the empire, famous for its tropical climate and the home to our protagonist Corvo. And then finally, there is the primary island of Gristle, home of the capital city of Dunwall, defined by its seafaring natives, powerful navy, and whaling, which lies at the heart of the empire's social and economic identity. You arrive at Dunwall Tower after being gone for several months. You've been sent on an emergency mission by the Empress to gather emergency support from the neighboring islands to combat a plague that has ravaged the capital city, the Rat Plague. The waves splash against your boat as it rocks against unsteady tides. Seagulls swirl overhead, muting conversations, and in the distance, you will see a city in an almost dreamy, ethereal atmosphere. Your boat reaches the waterlock to enter the palace, and you see the large gears and structures shift overhead as you rise. Your homecoming is temporarily improved as you're surprised by the Empress's daughter Emily. She runs to you and you embrace. Corvo is a silent protagonist, so the player is often relied upon to project their own feelings upon the character. However, a near 8 months in quarantine has taught me that in times of crisis and uncertainty, an embrace from a loved one often acts as the only real remedy, regardless of how small the act might be. After a quick lesson in tag and stealth mechanics, you move further along the courtyard into 2 more major characters within our story, Anton Sokolov and the High Overseer Campbell. Campbell is the leader of the Abbey of the Everyman, a religious militant organization native to Dunwall and the official religion of the Empire. In contrast, his portrait artist, Anton Sokolov, is a drunken, angry Rasputin-like figure, but also an incredibly significant figure for the Empire. He is the headmaster of the Academy of Natural Philosophies, whose whale oil-fueled inventions have driven the Empire into a form of golden age. Throughout the story, it's often a recurring joke that everyone wants their portrait painted by Sokolov, in his pure disdain for something that's clearly beneath his time and talents. Finally, you walk to the rotunda through the winding stairs and encounter the Empress speaking with her royal spy master, Hiram Burrow. You walk in at the end of the conversation, but it's clear the situation's pretty bad. People are dying, and all efforts have been futile to stop it. To further compound the situation, your last-ditch diplomatic effort has been an utter waste of time. The neighboring islands will not be assisting you, and rather have decided to blockade the city. Happy to see Dunwall die than risk exposure. In 2020 terms, the situation is quite fucked, and it's really only going to get worse from here. Suddenly, masked men run across the rooftops and into the rotunda. You fight them off as best you can, but it's clear that these are no ordinary assassins. They wield powers beyond your scope and incapacitate you while you, helplessly, watch your empress murdered and her daughter swifted away. Adding insult to your failure, both the spymaster and the High Overseer then accuse you of killing the empress and kidnapping her daughter. If it wasn't abundantly clear by their body language, you are being framed for a crime you didn't commit. Political and religious violence have historically laid the foundations for many an empire across history, and the Empire of the Isles is really no different. Even the title of Royal Protector was born out of necessity after Morley insurgents had assassinated the last empress. In this world, political violence is an expectation rather than an exception, and you are the unfortunate consequence of such. The wrong person, really at the wrong time. The game jumps 6 months ahead to Caldwell Prison, where you have been tortured, await execution, while your name has been slandered across the Empire. All really does seem lost until hope arrives in the form of bread and a key. Someone's looking out for you, and really without any better prospects, you escape your cell and hopefully regain your freedom. A quick explosive negotiation with the prison gate and a hop and a skip into the water below leads you to the sewers. You crawl, swim, and slide your way past an assortment of guards, explosive traps, and swarms of rats that will devour a human in 60 seconds flat. The game still feels and plays as any 10-year-old game for the previous generation could have, but the sewers provide an introduction to these movement mechanics. Shortly after obtaining your trusty folding sword and crossbow, you make your way to the end of the sewer into your first meeting with Samuel, the boatman who will ferry you to the mysterious supporters that have engineered your escape. As the scene comes into view, you're transported into a dilapidated and broken down district where buildings and homes have collapsed in on themselves, and those that haven't are boarded up and sealed to contain the plague. A sad, lost part of Dunwall, perfect for a rebellion to spark. And as you approach the dock, you can take the time to appreciate the art direction that allows such a sad little part of the world to still seem so vibrant as the orange sun's light shines over the dock bay and onto the nearby buildings. You arrive at the back door of the Hound Pit pub, and there you meet your fellow conspirators. First is Sir Admiral Havelock of the Crystal Navy. Havelock is a stoic military type, and often to a fault when interacting with others. He appears to be a man bound by duty and honor, and while definitely an elitist, he immediately treats the player as someone of high esteem. The same goes for his counterpart, Trevor Pendleton, who represents the aristocracy of this game. Pendleton is particularly important for the Loyalist cause, as he represents a vote in Parliament. The Empire is a constitutional monarchy, and his family holds important distinction in Dunwall's politics. Pendleton does come off as a bit limey and as pretentious as you'd expect from an aristocrat based on Victorian society. However, there is a self-aware charm to him that I always found endearing. His memoir recordings you can find in between missions essentially devolve into a recounting of failed love lives and yelling at servants. But what Havelock and Pendleton both exude in their conversations with you is their earnestness. The earnestness in their cause, in their belief, and in their passion in you, that they genuinely seem dedicated in returning the young Emily to the throne. Before the player can begin dismantling the new spy master's regime, you rest and awaken to find yourself in what appears to be the physical manifestation of the void, or at least in the perspective of the player. The void is a plane that runs parallel to the world of existence. The void is where all things go when they depart from this world, and it is heavily implied that the void will one day consume everything. As you walk up the stairs to the floating ruins of Dunwall Tower, you are greeted by the eponymous Outsider. The Outsider is the physical representation of the void and its powers. At one time in history, 4,000 years ago, the Outsider was a 15-year-old boy, sacrificed to a cult to become one with the void itself, and one with the void he became. His spiritual essence was forever linked with the void, becoming its avatar. He remarks that your actions have immense consequences in the days to come, and in his perspective, that interests him enough to brand you with his mark. The mark of the Outsider acts as a magical conduit between the player and the void. The Outsider is a source of all magic in Dishonored, and through the mark, you draw his power. You are but 8 people in the entire world to wear his mark, and many generations can pass before a new bearer is chosen. It takes more than simply social status, intelligence, or any other singular attribute to attract the Outsider. He even detests those who worship him in the void. The Outsider looks for agents of great change, whose decisions will have far-reaching implications. How the player utilizes the power given to them plays a major factor in this curiosity. For a godlike being that will exist for thousands of years after our time, the Outsider does come across as an incredibly bored individual. As the player character progresses through the game, you will meet those who've been touched by the Outsider, and the overwhelming majority of such are either unhinged or filled with regret over the use of their powers bestowed upon them, often with violence being a common denominator. For the Outsider, it must be like watching a different movie every day, but knowing the endings are always going to be exactly the same. As you progress, the Outsider will meet you at various shrines throughout the world dedicated to him, and he'll recount the events that had led up to that moment. If you played the game with low chaos, the game's internal mechanic for measuring your impact on the world, the Outsider will remark with humor and intrigue towards your choices. A high chaos playthrough will result in a much more mundane recap of events. Variety is the spice of life, and just like blowing up pedestrians in Grand Theft Auto or more singularly focused IPs like Hatred, killing folk just gets kinda boring after a while, and our black-eyed friend would be very appreciative if you'd shake things up a bit. A few skips with our new blink ability across floating, broken walkways with flying whales in the background, and we are given our next major key item, the heart. The heart is a grotesque, whirling menage of flesh and gears. It appears to have pulled the soul, or at least the essence, of the late Empress from the void, as her voice speaks to you the secrets and whispers of a particular area or character when using the heart. Mechanically, the heart guides the player to the various upgrade items and resources scattered across Dunwall. These come in the shape of bone charms and bone runes. Bone charms are the smaller of the two and provide smaller passive upgrades to the player and how the player can interact with the world around them. Things like having an enemy's chance to miss a shot, regaining extra health or mana from food or water faucets. Most of these upgrades are, admittedly, generally inconsequential, with the exception of the charm that lets you choke out people faster, a la Damien Maya. You could honestly go throughout the entirety of Dishonored without picking up a single bone charm, and honestly, probably never notice. Bone runes, on the other hand, are much more important and fund the character's upgrade system. Dishonored offers the player character non-lethal powers, lethal powers, and character buffs. Non-lethal powers include your blink ability, possession, stop time, and dark sight. Lethal powers include things like enemy bodies turning to ash, wind blast, and summoning devouring rat swarms. The player also has character buffs that will benefit both low and high chaos styles of gameplay. Frankly, I always found the non-lethal powers to be far more interesting, as upgrading your blink ability is an absolute must for traversal, and possession allows you to possess animals like rats and fish to exploit alternate routes, and later humans themselves for a shorter period of time. Bedtime is a particularly guilty pleasure of mine. There's just something very satisfying about activating it, running past a group of enemies, picking up a key item or two, then running back and no one was ever the wiser. In addition, you'll also be supplied by the inventor Piero at your base, and he'll give you a variety of non-lethal and lethal items to help combat any given situation you might run into. Sleeping bolts, pistol bullets, rewiring tools for proximity-based obstacles, spring wire traps that will decapitate an enemy like a mad weed whacker. Dishonored's design philosophy is that the player will be presented with a series of doors and that each door will have its own individual key.
but they will all lead to the same destination. The player will at least have several keys at any certain time to open those doors, and some doors may work even in conjunction with one another to help achieve your goal. Your first official mission on behalf of the Resistance begins with the need to eliminate the High Overseer Campbell at the headquarters of the Abbey of the Everyman. Samuel ferries you off to the civilian district, and through utilizing the heart, you'll be directed to the runes and charms scattered across the world. In doing so, the game encourages the player to utilize a variety of paths, strategies, and available powers to explore it to their heart's content. The world and people of Dishonored may have been inspired by the works of Lucian Freud, grandson to Sigmund. Lucian was known for his somber style and often utilized a thickly impastoed style of painting, which the artist utilizes thick layers of paint upon a particular surface area. The paint is laid thick enough to where the viewer can often see where the paint stroke dried and ended. It creates a texture that the painting itself is coming out of the canvas. Freud used this to create unsettling urban landscapes and intense portraitures, and often utilized a realist and brutal style of portraiture to achieve the effect, often leaving his models in pained positions for hours on end. As you explore through buildings and apartments, you'll find any number of corpses, often entire families wrapped up like packages, all victims of the plague. Below you in the streets and sewers below, you'll find the shambling weepers, those who caught the rat plague, but were not fortunate enough to just die, and unfortunately are left to bleed from their eyes, wailing in pain until they essentially topple over. The NPCs you meet along the way have faces wind-whipped and scarred from a lifetime of the sea, with voices graveled by the salt. Even the healthiest characters have eyes deeply sunken in and bruised. No single person had been spared by the hardships of the rat plague, but I'd reckon that life in many ways was just as intense for the average Dunwall citizen even before the pandemic. On your way to the High Overseer, you'll meet the notorious Granny Rags, a aristocratic woman who saw many a suitor in her youth, but instead chose a lifetime with the outsider, and is now blind, seemingly mad, and totally and completely unpredictable. She offers you whale runes in exchange for poisoning the local gang's illegal elixir still, and is a repeating presence throughout the story. She has such a malevolent force to her that even the outsider views her with a certain level of morbid curiosity, but advises the player to raise their guard around her. A few blinks, stabs, and rear naked chokes later along the way, along with avoiding some pesky wall of light installations, and now you have arrived at the Abbey of the Everyman. The Abbey is a long-standing organization that has deeply rooted religious significance to Dunwall and the establishment of the Empire as a whole. They believe that the world was born from the void, and the void will eventually come back to consume the world if they allow it. While they have no standing deity, they are dedicated to snuffing out worship of the outsider in all of its forms. In the early days of the Abbey, they were instrumental at the clearing out of aboriginal religious groups and people that they deemed worshippers of the outsider from Bristol. During the Siege of Whitecliff, in the early days of the Empire, the Abbey led a violent raid of essentially religious cleansing that jump-started the process of them becoming the official religion of the Empire of the Isles. Now, they act as a quasi-religious militant group whose golden masked overseers have full authority as the civilian police force and spiritual watchdogs. The Abbey traditionally oversaw civil matters such as weddings, providing counsel to citizens, and maintaining the yearly calendar and coordinating the yearly Fugue Festival, an event of celebrating the New Year's where people let go of past grudges and misgivings so that the year may start anew. But with their expanded oversight, granted by the Lord Regent himself, the Abbey is shown to be an extremely zealous and fanatical religious group whose methods are often spoken in hushed tones, even by those in authority. Overseers themselves of the Abbey are selected at a young age and indoctrinated according to the 7 scriptures, the Abbey's strict tenets of self-conduct. Only the most devout, the most faithful, and honestly the most masochistic of those recruits manage to become overseers. On a later mission, you can overhear 2 City Watch guards speaking about how the Abbey kidnapped a singer that had been approved by the new Lord Regent under the suspicions of her being a witch. It's not explicitly said what was done to her, but it's clear whatever happened to her broke her beyond recognition. Luckily, you managed to save an ally of the Resistance from such a fate, as your contact from within the Abbey has been strung up in a steampunk-esque public humiliation device. His name is Teague Martin, and he'll represent the religious estate of your group. For a devout member of the Abbey, he's surprisingly open-minded, later remarking about the Overseer's mark on your hand, but openly choosing to not make a fuss about it. Right behind Martin is the Abbey headquarters, a colossal mixture of neoclassic fascist architecture and Orwellian techno-oppression. Gosh, that's hard to say. Public radio sirens blare out ad nauseum and creating a crushing fascist atmosphere as you're publicly blamed for the death of the Empress over and over again. You can assassinate or incapacitate the Overseer in a number of ways. Frankly, I enjoyed cosplaying as Victorian Batman, so I took to the window ledges of the Abbey, climbed into the Overseer's meeting room, and incapacitated him. Really, it is a shame that this mission fails to flow more fluidly, given that the work that went into creating its atmosphere. While incapacitating the Overseer, you also have a side mission to save a family member of a loyalist before Campbell can poison him. There's something just a bit clunky having to hide both the bodies, backtrack with your ally's body to stash him in a dumpster for safekeeping, make the trek back, then be allowed to deal with the Overseer himself. If you go to the Abbey's library, you can read about something called the Heretic's Brand, a punishment that has been procured on any Abbey member, even the High Overseer himself, if they've been found to have broken Abbey tenets, but not tenets that would have resulted in his or her execution. Rather, a branded H is marked across their face, and they're left to a life of being shunned and destitute. Naturally, this is exactly what I did, and I didn't even feel bad about it. Not because I was satisfied with getting a little revenge, but because the High Overseer is a perverted creep of a human being. Behind a secret entrance, below the Abbey, you'll find the secret chambers of the High Overseer. Strewn about, apart from just money and food and stolen artwork, are dirty mattresses with open bottles of alcohol. On top of one of those mattresses, you'll find a letter from the Golden Cat brothel pleading for the High Overseer to stop damaging the girls, as this is already the third one this month. If the implication wasn't already abundantly clear, the letter leaves very little ambiguity. I felt an overwhelming level of disgust as modern society has become much more knowledgeable about sexual harassment and violence perpetuated by those in positions of power, both religious and in non-religious contexts. Me being born and raised a Roman Catholic and understanding the history of sexual violence that has been hidden and propagated by the church itself, this feeling hit particularly close to home. Your next major goal is located at the Golden Cat Brothel, a play on the Le Chat Noir cabaret club of 19th century Paris. It's operated by the Pendleton twins, the elder brothers of your colleague Trevor. They hold two key deciding votes for the Lord Regent in Parliament, but most importantly, they are the ones keeping hold of the kidnapped Emily. You can converse with Trevor, and he seems genuine in his apprehension to kill his brothers, despite their obvious and apparent vicious natures that you can recall from his memoirs. There was much said about this level during the game's development. Hell, even when you go to the level itself, the game tells you to play your way. It was often used to showcase the open level design of Dishonored, and the sentiment still rings true today, albeit the level being a bit more simplistic than originally advertised. By this point in the game, you should have a variety of powers or upgrades at your disposal, and the Golden Cat really serves as the first real opportunity to showcase them in their intended glory. There are an amusing number of lethal and non-lethal ways to complete your mission, but the most amusing method to me came out of getting information of an art dealer that's blindfolded and strapped into a retrofitted electric shock pleasure chair. After giving the Pendleton brothers a crash course in base diving, you incapacitate the brothel's madam and rescue Emily from the top floor of the dormitory. The scene mirrors the one at the beginning of the game with a simple exclamation of your name and a tight embrace. You both quickly escape and head off to the Helm Pits pub to celebrate a mission well done. Children in gaming have a history of being fairly poorly received by the audience, and often for reasons that go beyond just breaking the flow of the player's power fantasy. When they're not written insufferably, they often act as plot devices for a grizzled, cool, retired dad to turn back into a professional killer and avenge all those who've been taken from him. I remember one of the newer Tom Clancy Splinter Cell games structuring its story entirely around this premise, only to reveal in the third act that we had fooled you, player character, and your daughter really was alive. Like, this is our first time at the fair and we're not supposed to know the games are rigged against us. I remember the seriousness and attempted surprise of that reveal, and how it stuck with me as so comical and simultaneously insulting to my intelligence, as supposedly I'm supposed to be playing the greatest spy to ever live. I genuinely struggled to take the game seriously from that point on, and in turn, I never completed it. When they're not being held hostage or having their deaths faked, developers often design child characters as being defined by the fact that yes, they are indeed a child, and yet often fail to incorporate a significance to that beyond just the inherent powerlessness of childhood. Emily isn't entirely divorced from this convention, as her age does result in her being powerless to control her situation. However, while rescuing Emily was always a part of the plan, it was never the plan, and thus the game gives the player ample opportunity to understand her significance and her character in plot integral moments and various side conversations when in between missions. You'll find that Emily is likable, albeit a tad naive. She's naturally playful and blissfully unaware of the weight of the Empire on her shoulders. She is far more interested in learning about sword fighting and warfare than domestic policy. However, she's been through a lot and it really does show. She remarks about the possibility that her mother may still somehow be alive, as any child might hope, even though she saw that that's completely impossible. I never really paid this detail much mind when I was younger, but now, as an adult, this little scene stung a bit. Emily has never been given the chance to actually grieve and process her mother's death. Losing a parent at a young age is a deeply confusing experience, as it forces a young, impressionable, and developing mind to attempt to comprehend a subject that most adults struggle with as well. Despite her relative safety in the pub, she's still locked away from the world with very few people to interact and confide into. But whether she is ready or not, Emily is the rightful empress of a powerful and brutal empire. When she walks into a room, she's completely unaware of the impact she has on all those around her. Everyone, old and young, regardless of class, straightens their back, watches their tone, and demonstrates an amount of palpable respect that doesn't really feel phony. And as the quote goes, a child shall lead them. It's often as tired as it sounds, but Emily really is the next best hope for a prosperous future in Dunwall, even if she's the only person in the room that doesn't know it. There's a fitting interaction between Emily and Havelock where she's endlessly questioning him about pirates and sea battles, and you can see Havelock really doing his best to answer these questions and humor her as respectfully as possible. Emily genuinely does believe that these are questions that she needs to ask to become a good empress. She's been surrounded by political and religious violence her entire life, and by those willing to harm the people that she loves to attain power. She's young, but she's not ignorant to her situation, and thus is far more concerned with military strategy than local tax reform. Often the coolest jobs we fantasize about as children turn out to be much less exciting as we grow up. My late father was a tremendous fan of the movie Hot Fuzz, where at the end of the movie, after all the guns have been shot, all the explosions have gone off, and all the baddies have been cuffed up, there is a scene showing the absolute monstrous pile of paperwork the entire branch needs to file from the incident before they're allowed to do anything else. Often empires are maintained with the pen rather than the sword, and this displeasing reality of governance is a major theme for Emily's character in future titles. If it hasn't become abundantly clear by this point in the story, with the variety of subtle and not so subtle hints, you are Emily's biological father. When I was 14, I paid this detail no mind, and it was more of a fun detail to me that you would look up on Reddit than something of real story significance, and I guess in a way I wasn't entirely wrong in my thinking. Emily's parentage is a bit of an open secret in the upper crust of Dunwall society, but completely secret from the citizenry, and never ever explicitly acknowledged by anyone, to the point where Emily will always address you as Corvo, in private and in public, with the exception of a singular drawing. Corvo is in addition a silent protagonist, and how the player empathizes with this knowledge is purely on them. Luckily, I have not yet become a father since Dishonored released 10 years ago, but I have also grown up a lot since 2012. I lost my own father a few years back, and the knowledge of Corvo's fatherhood recontextualized quite a few scenes for me. When Emily has nightmares, or when she struggles to accept her mother's death, it's your child grieving the death of her mother and your lover, and much like in real life, there's very little you can actually do for her except just be there when she needs you. There's something that always stuck with me when you'd rescue Emily from a locked room. People who come from broken homes often are acquainted with the crushing loneliness for the child involved, as you're often just a casualty in a conflict not of your own making. With the knowledge of Corvo as Emily's father, I just couldn't shake that familiar feeling of being a child alone in a room, hoping that your parent would come in like a superhero and whisk you away to someplace better. For most kids, that day stays a dream, but for Emily it didn't. And as a man who has loved and lost and is learning to understand the perspectives of what's important in life, I can take the time to appreciate that. After kidnapping Anton Sokolov and bribing him with some very expensive liquor into joining your cause in what turns out to be a pretty uneventful side beat, your next real mission is to find and eliminate the main financial backer of the Lord Regent in Parliament. You discover that it is one of a triplet of sisters named the Boyles, an aristocratic family who had gotten rich during the pandemic selling crystals necessary for anti-rat swarm lights. The Boyles are throwing an extravagant mask soiree, and each Boyle sister is going to be wearing a different colored mask, but only one of them is the target. It's up to you to sneak in, find out who the right sister is, and eliminate her from the equation. In terms of level design and thematic presentation, the Boyle mansion is Dishonored at its absolute friggin' best. Outside the heavily guarded walls of Boyle Manor, tall boys, steampunk-esque rocket guards, and giant stoats are murdering and blowing up citizens in the streets. And the people that are left have resigned to a fate to die in their decrepit little apartments. Inside the manor, these decadent motherfuckers have golden whale statues spraying confetti and giant jello domes. The Boyle Manor itself is a vast mixture of tall painted walls and ceilings with extravagant gold trim, and the rooms are decked from floor to bottom with decor. In a 2020 COVID reality, where having a job and security are genuine blessings rather than privileges, such a blatant opulence during a time of suffering and rationing can and should leave the player with a drive to exact just a bit of societal karma. Mechanically, the Boyle Manor is probably the most complex in terms of player choice. When revisiting the game in 2020, I actively explored the manor for more than what I had done in the past, and had found that there were entrances, paths, and small encounters I had never known during my original playthrough. You have any number of ways of getting into the manor, and a variety of equally amusing strategies to eliminate your target. You can gather information on the Boyle sisters simply through chatting it up at the party, head upstairs and read the sisters' diaries to discover which one is the proper target, or just kill all three if you're feeling frisky. Once you discover the correct Boyle sister, you can either kill her or deliver her to a nobleman that is obviously infatuated with her beyond a reasonable degree. He will transport her to an unknown location where he'll be free to show her how much that she should love him for the rest of her life. I ultimately chose to deliver the sister to the nobleman, under the guise that it was the non-lethal way of going about things, but the decision still never quite felt right to me, even back in 2012. In a Me Too age of exposing the sexual predation of those in power and those powerless to stop them, I ended up feeling quite grimy from this decision and wondered if it would have been better to just kill the sister and been done with it. While your masked friend assures you that she'll live a good life, and she most likely will given the wealth of the nobility in Dishonored, the implications of the situation still felt wrong and gross. To further compound my conflicted feelings, the surviving Boyle sisters will send you a letter in a whale rune to thank you for sparing her sister's life despite the circumstances. Did I do the right thing? What type of life is worth living if you really have no control of it? With the financial support of the Lady Boyle gone, the Lord Regent is finally isolated and ready to be eliminated by the player. He is currently hiding away in Dunwall Tower, and the player must traverse a variety of guards, machines, and traps to reach the palace safely. In terms of characters, Hiram Burrow's characterization might be the most frustratingly written in Dishonored. Before his coup, he was the Empress's loyal royal spymaster, whose compulsive desire to have things set in order led him to be effective against the crime elements in Dunwall. Several years before the coup, the Empress and Burrow had disagreements over Hiram's internal investigations to find any traitors or spies within the government that, according to him, must exist. He was distressed at the trusting nature of the Empress and the perceived lack of respect, security, and order for the Empire. With this knowledge, the player character is allowed to make sense of Burrow, and his actions, when thought about within the context of Dunwall's historically violent society, make a lot of sense. Despite his betrayal, he and the Empress were friends once upon a time. While exploring his room, one can overhear Burrow remarking to a guard about the area he used to drink tea with the Empress with, and reminisce sadly about how those were better days. Where his characterization begins to fall apart is when he becomes a Saturday morning cartoon villain. The optional non-lethal method for this area is playing a recording on the propaganda machine of Burrow admitting to being the one that released the rat plague into the poorest parts of the city in order to eradicate the poorest of its citizenry. When his plan naturally spiraled out of control, he began conspiring to betray the Empress, whom had suspected foul play. The callousness of his voice in this recording, and the remarking on how those dang poor people couldn't just often die like they were supposed to, was Skeletor ruining the day He-Man was born levels of cartoonish villainy, and really not a perspective that can be changed if the player decides to go a low chaos non-lethal playthrough. Upon returning to your hideout, there are celebrations, drinks, and cheers in your honor. You saved the future Empress, killed her betrayers, and saved the Empire, and you're only halfway through the game. Wait, what? Right. So, as you stumble your way back to your quarters, you pass out. In what turns out to be a bit of an obvious twist that you see quite a ways coming off, your allies have poisoned you and thrown your body into the flooded district. You only managed to survive because Samuel couldn't bring himself to kill you and only gave you half the poison. While the player could probably see this betrayal coming from afar, or because we've simply just been too conditioned to think about these things nowadays, I still felt a pang of sadness when revisiting this scene because I did believe in their earnestness to restore Emily to power, and that's probably because at the time your conspirators were being earnest in their words to you. It's discussed how once the player had eliminated the Lord Regent, the reality of the situation dawned upon the conspirators. Whether the Lord Regent's coup was legitimate or not, he was still the legal and recognized ruler of the Empire, and I just shot that dude in the face half an hour ago. There's also not to mention the actual elimination of Parliament members and aristocracy such as the Pendleton brothers and Lady Boyle. Frankly, somebody has to answer for all that, and in their fear, they made a knee-jerk decision to scapegoat the player while holding Emily as political capital. Emily's reign is a hope to breaking the political violence so intrinsic to Dunwall, but in their uncertainty and in their cowardice, perpetuated that cycle of violence until the next inevitable political revolution. Your half-dead body is then fished out of the water by the same group of assassins that were hired to kill the late Empress. You meet their leader, a scarred-faced man named Dodd. Dodd is a fellow bearer of the Outsider's Mark and a frequent visitor of his shrines. They take away your gear, throw it in the water, and then imprison you in a floor cell. Now, if I'm going to be completely honest here, this is my least favorite area of the game. This area of the flooded district, there's a lot of swimming around, a lot of dealing with the giant river crust mollusks that deal a lot of damage and are quite frankly very annoying to kill. And after you get your gear back and you finally approach Dodd's base, it's not exactly the most exciting encounter and ends fairly shortly. While yes, you can go in aggressive and sword swinging and guns blasting, and while that is fun to do, especially with Dodd's assassins also having powers of their own, if you're going for a non-lethal or a low chaos playthrough and you want to stick with that theme, unfortunately it's actually pretty easy to choke out all of Dodd's assassins, and when you finally get to the man himself, the encounter actually ends fairly briefly as well. When encountering Dodd in his base, if you choose to encounter him under a stealth approach, you can actually overhear his recordings of him and his immense guilt that he feels over pulling the mission on the Empress. He states that all the royals, all the leaders, and all the aristocrats that he's killed over the years, and all the money that he's made, this was the one mission that actually felt dirty to him. That the implications and the consequences of his actions murdering the late Empress made him feel as if he had committed a great sin that there's no hope to ever be forgiven for. Naturally, the player can choose to relieve Dodd of his life, or to simply incapacitate him and steal some of his money, to show him that yes, sometimes that living is the biggest punishment of all. So I'm actually going to take a couple minutes here to simply just gush about how much I love the second area of the flooded district, despite the fact that I just spent the last couple minutes heavily criticizing the first area. And that's because I think that these two areas of the game, and specifically within this level, are emblematic of a lot of the gameplay pacing problems that I found with this game on my first playthrough back in 2012, and especially now it's far more noticeable in 2020. Now, this is going to be a bit of an aside, but I think it's also an important critique about the gameplay pacing and how Dishonored breaks up the action in its story that honestly really needs to be addressed, because I see a lot of videos on this platform about people praising Dishonored's level design as simply perfect and without flaw, and while there are many levels in this game that are very stunning and are almost designed perfectly, there's also a lot of downbeats in this game as well that are less than stunning, to say the least. Now, you might have noticed that I essentially just skimmed over the mission to kidnap Anton Sokolov, and that wasn't by mistake. I find that mission to be very linear by design and fairly uninteresting. The mission from beginning to end is a straight line to cross Cauldron's Bridge to kidnap Sokolov in the first place, and Cauldron's Bridge is not interesting enough as a landmark to justify such a rapid shift in level design. It's very hard to believe, and honestly, it was kind of jarring for me, even in 2012 and in 2020, to have such an open mission like the Golden Cat Brothel right before to only be dunked into this straight line of a linear mission right afterwards. And I think the first area to flood district being so banal and mundane really is emblematic of the biggest issues that I have with Dishonored from a gameplay pacing standpoint. That when Dishonored is hitting all of its high notes, it really is something to behold. But when Dishonored has those down point times of gameplay, when there isn't a significant set piece to build a area around, or if that set piece itself isn't that interesting, these areas can be really a bit of a slog to get through and often struggle to hold the character's attention until afterwards when the next big set piece level is finally introduced. Now, that being said, the second area of the Flooded District is absolutely fantastic and is Dishonored at its absolute peak in terms of environmental storytelling. The player character can explore the variety of factories and broken down whaling ships that make up the Flooded District and act as hollow reminders of maybe a prosperous past that's been long and forgotten. If you look up towards the sky, there's this almost hazy atmosphere that surrounds the buildings and factories, almost if the world itself wants to pretend that this little decrepit area doesn't exist. There is a fair amount of verticality to this level as well, and through that verticality, the player character can traverse across the numerous rooftops of the apartments and factories that scatter the district and into the area of Red Shore Gate, where you need to get through to return to the Hound Pits pub. Red Shore Gate is where Dishonored hits on the head its themes of Orwellian techno oppression better than any other area of the game. The area is scattered with tall boys who are blowing up and killing citizens and weepers alike, with very little discrimination between one or the other. You have guards patrolling the area, just hoping, praying to be sent somewhere else. People that are alive are often left in their apartments and have resigned to a fate of either getting shot in the street or dying in their apartments alone and sad. The area itself reminds one of something out of maybe a post-World War II bombing run in a major European city than an industrialized empire and city capital compared to the other areas of the game that we've seen so far. The old city sewers of Dunwall are the last area before the player character returns to the Hound Pits pub, and the area itself is actually fairly entertaining and provides its own unique story beats. After passing by Weepers and a refugee camp of citizens living in the sewers themselves, Dishonored actually introduces what I would consider to be its only real boss fight. You stumble upon Granny Rags having locked up the leader of the Bottle Street gang, the gang that you had poisoned the elixir still for earlier in the game, and is planning to murder or sacrifice him in some bizarre occult ritual to the outsider. Slackjaw is a character that you meet several times throughout the game, and while he is an incredibly brutal gangster, even for the standards of Dunwall, he's also somebody that's provided you no harm and is actually the person that allows you to have a non-lethal option of playthrough when you're completing the Golden Cat Brothel mission. With that being said, I simply couldn't bring myself to kill my pirate cosplaying buddy when asked by Granny Rags, and this upset her very much. Granny Rogs' boss fight is actually pretty fun, albeit a bit simplistic. What you need to do after she drops the layer of fog over you in the caves is that you need to go up to her room, grab her visage, and throw it in the furnace. After that's been completely destroyed, it's up to you whether you want to actually kill her or just shoot her in the face with a sleep dart. All's well that ends well, you save your pirate cosplaying buddy, and you go about your day. Upon your return to the Hound Pits pub, you'll discover that the trio of Martin, Havelock, and Pendleton had murdered all of the hired help and citizen supporters of the resistance for the same reason they tried to kill you. The pub is now overrun with City Watch guards, and after helping Sokolov and Piero knock out all the guards with a souped-up electric light trap, you race off to King Sparrow Island to once again clear your name and rescue your daughter. King Sparrow Island is a barren landmass turned fortress off the coast of Dunwall. In its center is Burroughs Lighthouse, a monolithic structure of metal that stretches towards the sky and is topped off with the Lord Regent's glass penthouse. The area will be dark and on high alert for high chaos playthroughs, but is still heavily populated with walls of lights, alarms, overseers, and City Watch guards regardless of your playthrough or chaos level. This is the final chance for the player to utilize all of the skills they've learned in the game, so feel free to let loose and really use your entire arsenal. Once you pass the obligatory courtyard of techno oppression and atop the lighthouse itself, you'll find Havelock that, in his short-sightedness and in his fright, already really did most of the work for you. He's killed Martin and Trevor in one last political purge, and you handle the mentally broken Havelock as you see fit, and secure Emily's place on the throne, securing a long, fruitful, and hopefully prosperous reign for years and sequels to come. You know, I've been thinking about making this video for a very long time, but never felt quite right about it or the timing. I guess it took the entire world changing and an abundance of free time to finally get me off my ass, but the world really does seem so much more cynical than it did even 5 years ago. Facebook turned out to be Satan, the rest of the modern world's adoption of mass surveillance, Brexit, basically anything in American politics for the last 4 years. It can be really hard to feel optimism or to feel hopeful given all of the odds that seem stacked against the average citizen. Frankly, if I'm being honest, everything does feel a bit shit right now, and that's okay. Sometimes things need to be a bit shit for a while before we can understand why these things have come to this point, rather than just blaming each other in the present. Maybe that's why I decided now is the right time to do this video, that while Dishonored is a fairly cynical story about how the nature of differing ideologies can lead to a cavalcade of dire consequences on the nation as a whole, I like to think that beyond those cynicisms, there is a distinct desire and want to believe that there's something better at the end of all of it. That one can have unironic hope in a better future and not feel silly to say it. And finally, and maybe most importantly, that this experience that we have as human beings is something that's much better experienced together, rather than with knives at each other's throats. Hello everyone, thank you for watching to the video if you're still around. This is my very first video I ever posted on YouTube, and hopefully the one of many as I continue to make these different video essays about different video games that mean a lot to me, but also to the video game medium as a whole in the future. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and hopefully you subscribe to my Patreon as well so that I can continue to do this in the future. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.